Welcome to this how-to video for the How to Learn Spanish ebook. So in this video I'm going to show you how to get the most out of the ebook and also cover the fundamental principles for language learning so that you can make a great start learning Spanish. So we'll start by going to the table of contents. Now you'll see here that there's a lot there, and it's all numbered and arranged into parts, chapters, sub-chapters and sections. And this structure is what makes the How to Learn Languages guides so flexible to use. You can use it as a follow-along where you go from cover to cover, or as a reference tool where you jump from section to section based on what you're looking for at a given time, go back to find more resources to use, or if you just want to refresh your memory about a certain concept or how to go about doing something for the process, it's all there for you and easy to find. Now, there are 5 key parts to the ebook, but before we get into those, we've just got a few things up in the top left here worth mentioning. Now, how to use this guide, we're covering that now. Why I started How to Learn Languages, you don't have to read that, but I've included it just in case it's interesting and useful for you to hear about my experiences learning languages and how those experiences shaped my understanding of how to learn languages, and therefore why I created How to Learn Languages. But as I said, you don't need to read that, it's just in case, I know some people find it interesting to hear about the context of the stuff they're watching or reading, how it was created and stuff, and why it was created. And then we've got defining fluency. Now, I won't go into too much detail here as it's there in the ebook, but it's worth quickly mentioning. Fluency, sometimes when people hear fluency, they think of, speaking the language like a first language speaker, like a Spanish speaker, but it's not exactly what fluency is. Fluency is not quite that level. That level is proficiency. Speaking a language like a first language speaker, that is proficiency. Fluency, if you're fluent in a language, you're still very comfortable in the language. You can, understand the vast majority of what you listen to or read, can speak without having to pause for much thought, stuff like that, but not quite the level of a first language speaker. So if you follow the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference, for languages, I guess fluency would be somewhere in the B2 level, probably high up in the B2 level. As B2's widely acknowledged to be quite a broad level, and proficiency is C1, certainly C2. Now, some of the differences between B2, C1 depends on who you ask, but that's a broad definition for fluency anyway. Now, in terms of the 5 key parts of the guide, the first one, the overview we have here, whether you want to use the guide as a follow-along or as a reference tool, I'd absolutely recommend reading the overview, regardless of how you want to use the guide, because it covers, the fundamental principles for learning languages and how to learn Spanish in terms of, some of the more controversial aspects of language learning, such as how to study grammar, things like that. And just quickly on that, worth mentioning now, if you enjoy studying grammar in isolation, by all means go ahead, use it as a separate part of the process. But if you don't enjoy studying grammar in isolation, that's absolutely fine, you don't have to. Now, we'll get on to the following 4 parts of the guide shortly. Introduction to Spanish, settling in, the path to fluency, and what next. But before that, I'll just talk a little bit about the fundamental principles for language learning. Not only because this will give you a great start for when you learn Spanish, but it will also give you a very clear understanding of how this ebook has been set out, in terms of the stages you'll be following to learn Spanish. So, and again, by the way, this is all covered in the ebook, so don't worry about making notes if you don't want to. Just sit back, relax, have a cup of tea or whatever, and just enjoy the video. So, this is all in the How to Learn Languages section. There are 3 pillars to learning a language, and these are passive learning, active learning, and practice. Now, passive learning, fortunately for us, it's the easiest to follow and also arguably the most important. it basically just involves immersing in Spanish as often as you can. Now, what's so useful about this is that because it's passive, you can attach it to parts of your day that you'd be doing anyway, like your commute to work, cooking, cleaning, exercise, anything you can think of where you can listen to Spanish without having to concentrate on what you're listening to. Now, one thing worth mentioning about passive learning is that it's absolutely essential that from the start you immerse in Spanish, listen to Spanish that Spanish speakers would listen to, first language speakers would listen to. You won't be able to understand much, if any of it, at the start, but that's fine, and that's exactly why you're listening to it, because you need to build up your brain's familiarity with the sounds and sound patterns of the language. Obviously, I go into more detail in the guide, so feel free to read more about it there, but just know for now that it's very important and it's a constant throughout the whole process. You'll always have some time immersing, listening to Spanish, and the type of Spanish that Spanish speakers would listen to. Now, an important thing to mention is the idea of comprehensible input, which you may well have come across on YouTube. There's loads of YouTube videos out there going on about the importance of comprehensible input. I personally don't think of language learning in those terms. I think it's a bit misleading, and not deliberately, of course, but in terms of the wording gives the wrong impression for people. Because it includes input, people then think it's related to immersion, when immersion should be a separate thing, really, at its most passive form, for the passive part of the language that we've just covered. So basically, comprehensible input as a concept means focusing on, content resources where you can already understand anywhere between, say, 70 to 90% of the content. And the idea is that because you can already understand the majority of it, the remaining 30, 10, 5% you don't understand will be much easier to learn and pick up based on your understanding of the rest of it. Now, as a concept, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It does, it makes sense and it does work to a point, but it's not applicable to the passive part of learning a language. The passive part, your immersion, should be completely for content materials that Spanish speakers would use, first language speakers would use. That's why I think, the term comprehensible input, because of the word input, beginners in a language sometimes think, oh, okay, I need to be listening to Spanish that's like really slow or for children that I can at least understand a little bit of, but that's counterproductive. You have to listen to this language as it's listened to by first language speakers. So the sooner you start doing that, the better. The faster you'll build up your familiarity. Now, where comprehensible input can be really useful is for active learning, and we'll get onto why in just a moment. But first, to explain active learning is essentially, when you boil it down, it's just about sentence collecting, or, learning new phrases, basically. You'll have seen that given other words, maybe like chunking, sentence mining, but they all boil down to this same thing, which is learning new phrases, and learning new phrases in their entirety. So, not, looking at a word list and trying to learn individual words. That's not a fun and not an effective way to learn a language. You learn sentences as a whole, and that way you not only develop your sense of how you might be able to use that sentence in conversation, you learn all the words in that sentence, so you're getting more bang for your buck in that sense, but also there is grammar in every phrase, so you'll also be naturally improving your understanding of Spanish grammar. Now, sentence collecting is, that's the fundamental part of active learning, and in its most basic form, you could literally just go to YouTube videos that list phrases in a language and learn those phrases, work your way through it, learning those phrases. That's it in its most basic form. If you wanted to do it like that, you absolutely could. However, if you want to make it a bit more interesting, a bit more engaging, you can use active listening and reading, which is basically doing sentence collecting, but using content or materials that either first language speakers would use or that have been designed in an interesting way for people learning Spanish. Now, this is where comprehensible input can be really useful, because if you come across a resource which is marketed, labelled as comprehensible input, chances are it'll be really useful for active learning, because you'll be able to work your way through the content, in perhaps like a level of progression they've set up already for you, or it might just be a bit less daunting than trying to actively learn, a paragraph, a whole page maybe of a newspaper article that first language speakers would use. So yeah, it can be really interesting and useful for active learning, but just remember, don't think in terms of comprehensible input. It's unnecessary. It has nothing to do with the passive part of the process, and for active learning, you don't need to divide it up in those terms. With active learning, you just need to focus on whatever you find interesting. As long as you're using the content to actively learn the language, collect phrases, then, you're on the right track, so don't worry. The important thing is whether you find it interesting and enjoyable or not. Now, in terms of how to remember what you learn during active learning, there are various ways you can do this, but the fundamental thing, the most important thing, is to use the phrases you learn. And obviously the most effective and authentic way to do that is to use them in conversation with Spanish speakers. And that's where the final part of the process comes in, which is practice. Now, practice with Spanish speakers, aside from the obvious in terms of, it'll make you better at having conversations with Spanish speakers, it also, as I said, will reinforce your active learning and will also improve your confidence in the language, which is also important, and just build your sense of when a phrase would be appropriate, when it wouldn't be appropriate, when the tone of a phrase. Like, for example, you might have learnt a phrase and got a general sense of how it might be used, but you might actually find that when you're practicing with Spanish speakers, or when you're immersing, for example, you notice that phrase and realise, it's actually used in a slightly different context to what I thought it might be. So all the three parts of language learning complement each other. Phrases you cover in active learning, you will suddenly start to notice during immersion, and vice versa. And also during practice with Spanish speakers, that is a very important time to get feedback about how you can better use the phrases you're learning, and also just to remember the phrases themselves by using them. Now, just very quickly to finish off that, for the active part of the process and how to remember what you learn, other ways include, spaced repetition systems you've probably heard of, like Anki and flashcards. But there's other ways you can go about it as well, and we'll get into that shortly. Now, as I said, the overview that we've just sort of done a brief run through, I'd absolutely recommend reading that regardless of how you want to use the guide. From then on, it's a matter of personal preference on your part. So, Introduction to Spanish. This, you don't have to read most of it, but I would at least, if you don't want to do much reading, obviously I'd recommend reading all of it if you enjoy reading and are happy to. But if there's only one part of the introduction you read, I'd recommend it was here, 2.4, the orientation, because in here you've got information about the alphabet and pronunciation, which is obviously an absolutely essential starting block for learning any language. And in that, you'll find links to a series of videos by some fantastic YouTube channels for learning Spanish who take you through the alphabet and pronunciation. So that'll give you a great foundation. I then cover about the speed of the language. I think, I guess you could apply this to any language, but especially Spanish. There are times when you will notice Spanish being spoken at what seems an unbelievably fast pace, and it can be quite daunting at first. So in that part, I just explain that a bit for you, explain the variation in different parts of the Spanish-speaking world in terms of how fast people speak, and just to help you not feel too daunted by it, hopefully. And then below that, I'd also recommend reading 2.4.3, the Head Start. Now this is all about all the shared vocabulary between Spanish and English, and there's a huge amount. So the idea with this section is to give you a lot of encouragement when you start the process, because as an example, if you were to, having never studied Spanish before, for example, if you were to pick up a Spanish book right now and scan through a few pages, you'd be surprised at just how many of the words would jump out at you based on their resemblance to English words. Now, of course, spelling will be slightly different, pronunciation will be different, but you'll be able to see that it's very clearly related to an English word. So in that section, We go through all that, so I definitely recommend reading that. You'll feel even more confident about the process after doing so. And in that part, in that section, I do also briefly explain the history, like why English and Spanish have a lot of shared vocabulary. If you're interested in more detail about the history of the Spanish language, we've got a whole chapter here, the history chapter, and obviously I'd recommend reading it, but if you're not into reading, of course you don't need to read it, but it will, if you do read it, it will really enrich the process for you, give you a much deeper understanding of the Spanish language, and you'll find that what you read in there, during the process of learning Spanish, things will just crop up when you don't expect it to, like you'll come across a word, and during say immersion, active learning or practice, and you go, actually that word's familiar because I read about how actually it's an Arabic word that came into Spanish during the 8th, 9th, 10th century, whatever, and just moments like that, information like that really enriches the process in my experience. So yeah, I'd recommend reading that if you enjoy reading and have the time. And in terms of when to read it, it's up to you really. You could, you don't need to read it where it's stated in the table of contents. You could wait a bit later if you're itching to start the rest of the process, read the rest of the guide, that's fine. Now, in terms of this bit here, why learn Spanish, defining Spanish, I'd recommend reading Defining Spanish just to get your bearings on, the variety of Spanish spoken around the world, but also the unity of the Spanish language, the relative unity of it. And the why learn Spanish part, I'd recommend, you probably don't need to read it now because the fact you're here suggests, you've already got lots of motivation to learn the language and are already familiar with your reasons for wanting to learn the language. However, learning anything, and especially learning a language, it's not a short process. It can take months, even years at times, depending on our schedules and other factors. And there will be days where your motivation just feels different, and it could be for loads of other reasons which have nothing to do with the actual learning process itself. And so on days like that, you might find it helpful just to read the Why Learn Spanish part, just to try and reignite some of the enthusiasm on days where you've been made a bit weary by other things, busy with other stuff, that sort of thing. So anyway, moving on to part 3, settling in. So this is a part of the process which can last anywhere between a few days to a few weeks. It's up to you really, based on your preference. But I consider it an essential part of the process because what you'll do is you'll just spend, as I say, a few days to a few weeks, up to you, immersing in Spanish, like listening to the language as much as possible, doing a little bit of reading just to get used to how the language looks, but especially listening to the language on your commute to work, cooking, cleaning, exercise, anything you can think of like that really. And what that will do is it will build up a very strong base for you when you start incorporating the active and practice parts of the process. For example, if you didn't do a settling in period and you just immediately started collecting phrases and practicing with Spanish speakers, for example, if you've never delved into Spanish before at all, it will seem very unfamiliar to you. It'll be a bit of a shock, and you won't get as much out of it, I don't think, in those early stages. So I recommend settling in a few days, a few weeks if you can, but if after a few days you find that you're just itching to get on with the active part of the process and practicing with Spanish speakers, that's absolutely fine. By all means do so. But if you're not in too much of a rush, I would recommend just letting yourself take a few weeks to just immerse in Spanish each day. Get used to, you can see here we've got lots of resources for immersion. Get used to the different resources mentioned in the guide, see which ones you like, because this is again why the guide's structured like this, easy to reference. The resources you first come across and pick out in the guide, you'll then later on, when you go back and look at it, notice other resources you want to use. So if you have a few weeks for the settling in period, you'll be able to try out lots of different resources, and by the time you start active learning and practice, you'll feel very at ease with the process you're going to be following. And now just to reiterate again, this passive part of the process that you start during the settling in period, that continues throughout the whole process of learning Spanish. Now, we'll just have a very quick look at some of the resources, we've got podcasts, radio, music, audiobooks, books, series, films, news and articles, but we'll go to the YouTube one. And aside from these Spanish learning channels, which are also great for active learning as well, of course, we've also got, vlogs, a bit of everything here, comedy, travel, current affairs. Like, just for example, if we go here to the channel of Yalitza Aparicio, she is a Mexican actor. She's been in some very famous Mexican films, but she creates all sorts of interesting videos about Mexican culture and also indigenous Mexican culture, such as this one.
Hola a todos, muchas gracias por estar nuevamente en su canal Yalitza Aparicio, y el día de hoy los traje a Teotitlán del Valle, un lugar maravilloso en el cual vamos a aprender un poco sobre el proceso del chocolate, y nos tomamos el tiempo para venir a el sabor ancestral de Oaxaca con nuestra amiga Aurora, y vamos a ver cómo se prepara el chocolate, así que vamos.
So as you can see there, that was a video about how chocolate's prepared in the Oaxaca region of Mexico. And yeah, so if you're interested in learning about Mexican culture, for example, and also wanting to improve your Spanish, stuff like that is very useful, and there's all sorts of channels like that listed in the guide. So let's go back to the table of contents. Now, yeah, once you've completed the settling in period, be it a few days to a few weeks, depending on your preference, you then start the path to fluency, number 4 here. Now, the crux of that is that you will also incorporate active learning and practice at this point to go alongside your immersion each day. Now, we start by looking at passive learning in a bit more detail so that you can get even more out of it. For example, with just small tips and tricks like changing the language of your devices or of your phone into Spanish, that sort of thing. And then we cover active learning in great detail. Now, if you're wanting to use this guide as a reference tool, we've got an overview of active learning here, which is like the essential bullet points you need to know. But if you want to dig down into more detail, we cover sentence collecting, free resources and paid resources for sentence collecting. Now, we also cover sentence creating, which you'll see more detail in there, but just briefly now, when you collect sentences, a really helpful way to get even more out of it is to then swap out words from the sentence or phrase and put in other words to make a new sentence or phrase. And this is just a really great way not only to build your confidence in Spanish, but also to develop your understanding of the grammar of these phrases in a natural way, whilst also, opening your own eyes to the array of phrases you can learn just by learning one phrase. By swapping out words, you've then got loads of other phrases. Now, one caveat to mention is that it's important to try out the phrases you create in practice with Spanish speakers, because not every phrase you create will actually be a phrase Spanish speakers would use, and that's fine. Making mistakes in inverted commas is a very important part of the process, and it's also a very natural part of the process. So don't think of it in terms of mistakes. Experiment with your sentence creation, and some of the sentences you create will be stuff that Spanish speakers would or could say. So yeah, be sure to get feedback and don't be afraid to try out different sentences. Now, in the active listening and reading part, we cover a bit of the theory behind that, but also different resources you can use for active listening and reading should you wish to make your sentence collecting a bit more interesting and engaging. And then in how to remember what you learn, we mentioned previously that practice with Spanish speakers, i.e. using the stuff you learn, is the most effective way to remember it, but there's other techniques you could use, and also that I'd recommend using alongside your practice. Now, we've mentioned spaced repetition systems like Anki, which are basically flashcards, which you might be familiar with already, as an idea anyway. You don't have to do that though. They can be helpful, and I certainly would recommend using them if you enjoy them, but if you don't enjoy using them, you don't need to use them at all. They have their drawbacks, they're not perfect, and for some people they can be a bit boring. I personally find them a bit boring. I much prefer to use some of the other techniques mentioned, like for example when actively learning Vietnamese, I just kept a notebook in Vietnamese, wrote a notebook, and found that very enjoyable compared with flashcards. So just go with whichever way you prefer. And after that, we cover practice, different forms of practice, typed or audio, and the apps you can use like Tandem and HelloTalk. And after that, the final thing really for the key part of the process is putting it all together, which is creating your routine for immersing, active learning practice each day. And obviously there's more detail you can read in the guide about that, but the fundamental thing to mention right now is that you should be flexible. Our lives, our schedules change on a monthly, weekly, even daily basis at times. Things always come up, we're busy with all sorts of things. So when that happens and you're not able to spend as much time on Spanish as you would have liked for a day, a week, a month, however long it may be, try not to get too disheartened. It will be frustrating, but try not to let it get you too down about the process, and don't be afraid to be flexible with your plan for learning the language. For example, you'll see on YouTube examples of people creating very elaborate, very detailed, like Notion templates, spreadsheets and stuff like that, and that's all great and fine. If you enjoy that, by all means do that. But don't then don't be too disheartened if you have to adjust it as you go because other stuff gets in the way. For example, what I tend to do, which I find is quite a nice balanced approach to having a plan, but also being flexible and adaptive with the various paces of our lives, is I use Apple Notes just to keep track of, what I'm working through for active learning in a language and some immersion I'm wanting to do, that sort of thing, and just keep it quite general and have it laid out for, a period of weeks or a month or two, but also I can easily just edit it and adjust it based on how my schedule's changing during that time. But, whichever way you go about it, just follow your personal preference and be flexible, because you'll need to be at times. Now, after that, we've got what next, and this is just about how to take Spanish further, how to keep improving once you reach fluency. And basically this just comes down to, I'm in Hanoi and it's an amazing city, but it's never quiet, which I like, but it does mean you will occasionally hear traffic in videos, so apologies. With what next, how to keep improving, it's basically just a case of continuing to immerse and practice with Spanish speakers, but also worth, learning about Spanish culture or the culture of Spanish-speaking countries, society, stuff that first language speakers would be able to talk about in detail, because that's usually what separates fluency from proficiency. And we've got here information about getting your Spanish level certified should you wish to. And then below this we've got stuff about Latin American Spanish, resources for Latin American Spanish, and resources for every Spanish-speaking country. Now, in the resources for immersion section you saw in the settling in part of this guide, there's also resources based in Latin America in there. So don't worry about, if you're wanting to focus on a Latin American form of Spanish, don't worry if it's only Castilian, resources based in Spain. There's also Latin American resources in that section. But if you're wanting to specifically find resources from a certain Latin American country, for example, you can find them here. And then below that, we've got a little bit about the indigenous languages of Latin America. One of the really nice things about learning Spanish is it then means, should you wish to, you can then learn about indigenous languages of Latin America, because very often the resources for learning about those languages will be in Spanish. Now after that we've got tutorials, how to add audio to flashcards should you wish to use flashcards, overcoming challenges. I'd recommend reading this whenever you're feeling down on motivation or you've had to take a bit of a break from learning the language, but the key thing to remember is not to worry, it's all part of the process sometimes. And then how to learn 2 languages at once. After learning a language, it's usually very enjoyable, so people often find they want to learn more languages, so you can learn more about that there. Images, any of the images you see in this guide, should you wish, if you think, that looks an interesting place, I'd like to visit there, you can see here where it was and who took it, on Unsplash. Contact, please feel free to email me at contact@howtolearnlanguages.info if you have any questions at any time. I'd be more than happy to help. And then just finally, reviews. If you enjoyed this guide, please do let me know, either by going to the reviews page of the website or by emailing me. I'd be delighted to hear your feedback. And that just about covers everything. I hope you really enjoy learning Spanish, and as I said, if you have any questions, just let me know.